Hello and welcome to the sixth in our series of asynchronous virtual roundtables on transportation, logistics, and supply chain networks under COVID-19. I'm Hani Mamasani, Director of the Northwestern University Transportation Center, and I will be your moderator. An asynchronous virtual roundtable is one where the interviews have already taken place and then have been integrated into a single roundtable. At the end of the question and answer period, there will be a live question and answer period, live Q&A, and you can ask your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. Today's topic is on leveraging technology for supply chain resilience under COVID-19. We have three panelists. First, we will have Stephanie Kolaczynski, who is the Chief Operating Officer of FourKites. Then we will have Stephen Brobst, who is Chief Technology Officer of Terra Data. And then we'll have Professor Yossi Sheffi of MIT. And without further ado, we'll go to our first panelist today. All right, great. So Stephanie, you're Chief Operating Officer at FourKites, which you joined in the early stages of the company in 2015. FourKites has since grown to be one of the largest predictive supply chain visibility platforms, serving a network of global 1,000 companies and third-party logistics firms. You've held several positions prior to that with various companies involved in operations, supply chain management. So you do have quite a bit of experience in our subject matter today in supply chain management and the role of technology in that process. But I do want to mention here that we're proud of you. You're a Northwestern graduate, and nice. that's before going on to get an MBA at USC. So it's always a pleasure to be talking to our alums. So great. So your company, FourKites, provides a software platform. I guess you call it more than that. It's a complete solution that helps customers gain real-time visibility and ETAs of products throughout their supply chains. And so through the data that you track and through your interactions with customers, what vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the supply chain or in various supply chains really have you seen surface during the current crisis?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, right? Because I think there are vulnerabilities and weaknesses that everyone knew, and they just have kind of come out as in this crisis. And the way I think about it is it's really the ability to adapt to changes, right? It's major changes in consumer demand, capacity constraints, regional changes, and the supply chain's ability to adapt to those. For us in the space that we're in, we most often see it in availability of data and supply chain professionals being able to quickly react to that data and make changes. So an example, right? Demand is surging in certain areas of the country and completely disappearing in other areas of the country. And the same is true in some industries versus others. And companies that have really antiquated systems or really outdated practices are struggling to make the adjustments to that. So one place we're seeing it is significant facility backups. I don't know if you've been on LinkedIn recently with your other supply chain professionals, but you've probably seen pictures of trucks down the block, right? Or horror stories of drivers having 24-hour wait times before they can check in at delivery facilities. And so those have really come up, I think, in this crisis and highlighted, in my mind, the lack of communication across the supply chain.
So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, several of the folks we've talked to have mentioned that a lot of the issues are at nodes, not so much along links, but really at nodes. That's where a lot of the delays, a lot of the disruptions are being experienced. So you mentioned communication, and to the one, every single 3PL, trucking company, carrier, railroad, etc., have emphasized the importance of communication. What challenges, I guess, have arisen that you're aware of, again, under the current crisis, and how is a platform such as FourKites helping in that regard?
Yeah, communication, like I said, super important. So I agree with all of the folks that have brought that up. What we're noticing is that historically supply chain has been about optimizing based on constraints, right? And so supply chain professionals are very adaptable, very smart, capable individuals, but they're used to thinking within a specific set of constraints, right? They're given specific things and they optimize within that framework. And I think historically, we haven't invested as much in collaboration and communication tools. And that's really why FourKites came out, right? We recognized it first in truckload visibility and got our start there, but have since expanded. And the place that we've expanded the most is in communication tools and the types of tools that break down silos between teams and systems. So an example, right from the beginning, we allow both shippers and carriers onto our platform. So customer signs up for visibility, both them and their customers get access to that same visibility so that they can use that data and be on the same page. We also have communication tools, right? So it's great to have visibility, but if you don't know when there are problems, you can't do anything about it, right? And so alerts in the system when loads are going to be late, or our customers can alert their customers when issues arise, and those can automatically be sent to customers. And so that helps streamline the communication and keeps people out of it. Another way that we're supporting communication is actually beyond in-transit visibility. And this is a newer thing for us, but we've expanded into a new appointment manager system and dynamic yard. And basically that takes the in-transit visibility and extends it beyond the transportation team. Because like we talked about, a lot of these issues that we've been having happen at nodes. And warehouse teams and transportation teams don't historically communicate with each other as frequently as I think is necessary to adjust to major changes. And so with in-transit visibility being extended to warehouse teams, the warehouses can have a better understanding of the trucks that are coming into their facility and make adjustments accordingly and change appointment times and other things like that to make sure that they can handle changes in demand.
So is this a new feature that you're providing, or is this a feature that existed, but now your customers are using it more?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that most recent example with our appointment manager and dynamic yard are actually new to the market, not just since COVID, but we're newer this year. Our communication tools like customer alerting and things like that are just getting used more.
So are you finding then that, I guess you're adding, resilience to your customers' supply chains through this collaboration capabilities that perhaps might have been there in the past, but is now really being leveraged more extensively?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely being leveraged more. It's interesting. We had one of our CPG customers was telling us a story about how they've just been overloaded, right? And in order to keep up with it, they had to transition their entire track and trace team to planning functions because there just weren't enough planners to keep up with the number of loads that they needed. And pre-FourKites, that would have completely decimated their customer service, right? They would have been doing all of the planning and not alerting their customers at all to what's going on. And with FourKites, they set up a few more automated alerts, right? A few more communications that go out without a human having to be involved. And they trained their customer service team to access FourKites directly. And with those two things, they've been able to maintain a high level of customer service while also pulling all of their resources onto planning activities. And so I think that's a way that we're making our customers more resilient.
So we've talked to several port managers, particularly the executive director of the Port of LA, for example, where they have made investments in digitalization and kind of putting up digital platforms so they could get the the ships that are coming in to interact with some of the ground operations and so on. Would because one of their concerns, of course, is the variability in terms of ships sailings, arrivals, and kind of matching up the capacity on the ground to handle containers that may be coming off the ships. Does your platform then interface at all with the kind of platforms that some of the major hubs like ports might be using?
We do a bit. We, I think, are helping out with ocean freight in a couple of ways. And admittedly, I'm not quite as familiar with port operations. And so I can't talk about the specifics within the port, but we do send and receive data, right, with their systems. And for our shippers, really the important thing is real-time visibility, right? And we provide that on containers for ocean freight. And so that's kind of step one. And they have found that tremendously helpful as they're trying to plan for their inbound inventory from overseas or their exports. And so I think that's kind of step one. We saw that huge drop off early on coming out of China, right? And then now it's recovering. And so our shippers have very much relied on real-time visibility to make sure that they're understanding how those changes impact their ability to get things to stores and other places like that. The other thing that we've done is we have a border crossing and port congestion map that we've actually made available publicly. And so that has just minimal data in terms of the amount, right? It's for port congestion, it's waiting for berth and waiting at port. But it can give folks an idea of what to expect if their goods are flowing through those ports. And if it's possible, sometimes there are ports relatively close to each other. You can redirect from one to the other depending on how their operations are flowing.
So you mentioned earlier, again, some of the surges that we're seeing in certain lanes, and then on the other hand, the disruptions that exist in others. And again, the carriers we have spoken to and logistics managers have mentioned that there is quite a bit of dynamic reallocation that is taking place, in the current circumstances. How can, again, technology, particularly the kind of platform that you have, help manage these uncertainties in real time and help add resilience to multiple supply chain networks?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about a few ways already, right? When you have access to real-time data, you can be a bit out ahead of those and make decisions that help you kind of adjust to those changes. I think a really interesting example, actually, and this is certainly leveraging the use of technology, but I think it highlights the importance of, it's not just technology, it's collaborative technology. So two companies, and this is actually was publicly announced, Cisco and CNS Wholesale are two of our customers. I don't know if you've seen this, but Cisco's, they're both food distributors. Cisco's primarily focused on the restaurant industry, and CNS Wholesale is primarily focused in grocery. And so, not unexpected, Cisco has some excess capacity, and CNS is very busy, and especially in specific pockets, right? And so they've formed an alliance, and Cisco is actually contributing resources to CNS. And part of that is FourKites collaboration, right? They're able to do that much easier because they have a shared visibility platform. And so as Cisco is contributing resources, trucks, people, warehouses, things like that, CNS has very easy access to visibility through our platform. And so we've been able to enable that alliance and make it easier on them in a highly complex situation.
So as you mentioned, you know, there's been a greater role, I guess, for technology-enabled services in this environment. And one of the questions that I'm interested in is, are we going to see perhaps more permanent changes to the transportation and supply logistics industry because of this experience? Phrased differently, is this accelerating perhaps some of the trends that had been taking place in the industry with regard to the role of platform technologies?
I certainly hope so. You know, I don't know for certain, but what I can say is that, you know, we see companies leaning into technology. We have two products that can be stood up very quickly. Our ocean tracking and a product called Network Visibility, which is actually our basic visibility platform, but allows for visibility between parties. And so let's say the example of a grocery store supplier and the actual retailer. So for example, we have 9 of the top 10 CPG companies, 18 of the top 20 food and bev companies on our platform. And so if you're a grocery retailer or kind of big box retailer, that's a big part of your volume. And we have the ability for them to come on and we can turn on that visibility within a few hours. And so we've seen companies really lean into that functionality, those type of technologies that they can access really quickly. Not all are like that. Some will take longer. But that makes me think that companies are making the connection between investment in technology and their ability to manage this crisis effectively. And so I think coming out of it, we will see more companies, even those that are not typically at the forefront of technological innovation, leaning into those technology-enabled services or just tech platforms in general to help make their supply chains more resilient. One of the things that I think will shift in technology spend is towards companies that enable collaboration, right? We've talked about it. I think historically, the industry invested a lot in optimization tools. And those tended to just be within themselves. And I think going forward, we will see more companies that enable collaboration be more at the forefront.
So you've mentioned, of course, visibility as being a key application or use of the platform, of the technologies that that you're working with. You've mentioned optimization, and so what other perhaps applications or key tools are your customers looking for to manage through the crisis? I know on your website you talk about machine learning, for example. Or can you maybe share with us some additional tools or capabilities, beyond, again, the real-time visibility that are playing or could potentially play a significant role?
Yeah. And, I think analytics are a big piece of the puzzle, and we haven't talked about those yet. You can't completely disconnect it from real-time visibility because I think it's related, right? You need real-time data in order to have helpful and action-oriented analytics. But we've seen a significant rise in usage of things like dwell time reporting. So we talked about facility backups, right? And we have a feature on our platform that allows our customers to look at the facilities across their supply chain and what the dwell times are those facilities are experiencing by pretty granular, right? So day of the week, time of the day, and that allows them to adjust. Maybe they make an appointment time at 10 a.m. instead of 2 p.m., right? And so I think it's those kinds of analytics that customers are really looking for to manage through this crisis. And then the other ones are, the alerting functionality and exception management that we've talked about. It's not just about visibility, it's the ability to communicate and make adjustments.
Sort of beyond, I guess, the current capabilities that you've mentioned, what do you see on the horizon? Leaving aside the crisis part of it, in terms of just because hopefully we won't remain in crisis for forever. What other technologies or emergent technologies do you see on the horizon? Again, going back to machine learning, possibly artificial intelligence,
that's
blockchain. Is there anything that sort of where you see an opportunity kind of waiting to materialize?
Yeah, and that's where I think AI and machine learning really come in. I didn't mention it previously. We use it, obviously. Our ETAs especially are very heavily reliant on those technologies. But I think we're really just at the tip of the iceberg of what they're capable of doing. I've been very impressed by our data sciences team's ability to adjust to this crisis. And come up with new applications of data that would not have been possible without AI and machine learning. At the same time, I don't think the industry totally understands those technologies quite yet, right? You see those terms thrown around a lot, and I do really consider them on the horizon. Turning machine learning into something that matters to a supply chain business is hard, right? Because it's not a thing in and of itself, right? It needs to be applied in a really actionable way. And so I think that in particular has the ability to completely change the way supply chain professionals do their jobs. And we'll see that I think accelerate even more coming out of the crisis because the impact it has made in the small ways it's already being applied and making folks more resilient.
So going back to the crisis, and just want to ask you this question. Of course, you're, as COO, you deal with operational issues that your customers may be experiencing. Has anybody called you at 3 a.m. and said, please help me out? Yet, or is that not the kind of issues you're encountering during this crisis?
We don't get the 3 a.m. What we do get is the same day I have an urgent shipment going into this place, and it either wasn't previously in scope for us or it's brand new business for us and we need to get it up and running right away. And to be honest, that's fun. I love that kind of stuff. I don't get those calls anymore, but our customer success team has a wins and challenges Slack channel that they share all of those stories. And we just have so many of, beds being delivered to hospitals, masks being distributed, and, really important things that need to happen. And these companies rely on our platform to make sure they're getting there on time and in full.
Excellent. Well, Stephanie, this has been very informative. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
I think the only thing that comes to mind is that no one knows what the future will hold. But I think this crisis has reminded us of the importance for planning for volatility. And so my hope is that companies who previously not been on the forefront of technology and been slower to adopt technology see this as an opportunity to lean into new technology solutions and understand how much that can help them be resilient through times of crisis.
Thank you very much. Again, very helpful, and I wish you and your family, your company, all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen, you're Chief Technology Officer for Terra Data and a leading expert in data warehousing. You've been on the Terra Data team since, I believe, about 1999, according to the information we got, after launching 3 successful startup companies related to high-end database products and services in the data warehousing and e-business marketplaces. You've also taught graduate courses at Boston University, at my school, MIT, in both MBA programs and in computer science departments. So you have quite a bit of experience in everything that is related to data and how data is used in companies, etc. Data, of course, is at the core of Teradata's DNA. And as CTO for Teradata, you're in unique position to see the big picture of how your customers are experiencing and dealing with the current crisis. And the role, of course, that data, information systems, data science are playing in helping them address not only supply chain and logistics issues, but really, indeed, all aspects of their business. You've seen other crises, you've seen ups and downs, disruptions, and so on. And how would you say the current crisis differs in its impact, again, on supply chains, logistics operations of your major customers, and in the role that data-related technologies might be helping to mitigate this impact?
Right, there are a couple of important differences. One difference is the current crisis is truly global in nature, whereas other crises were more localized. 9/11 was certainly a big disruption. You have smaller scale disruptions in the supply chain when hurricanes come running through Florida and things like that, but these are localized. And the other thing is that this is a much longer term disruption. For many of the disruptions, you could kind of batten down the hatches and kind of wait it out and wait till things got back to some form of normal. But waiting it out is really not an option in the midst of the crisis that we're in now. The crisis still is obviously going to linger on for much further than anybody ever anticipated at the beginning. And just waiting for it to go away is not an option. You have to reset to a new norm, and you have to be able to adjust more quickly. And the best way to do that is with data, with fact-based decisioning, because if you're making decisions based on experience, nobody has experience to deal with this kind of thing. You have to use data. On the other hand, even the data that you've collected over the last 7 years, a lot of that's going to be maybe not as useful as in normal times, because we are not in normal times. And so having up-to-date data and having detailed data is absolutely critical as well.
So how do the products then and services provided by a company like Teradata contribute to making your customers' transportation networks and supply chains more resilient? For example, several of our companies have mentioned reducing some of the unpredictability and variability by getting advance notice. Could you maybe tell us more about that?
The Teradata technology, our software, enables access to detailed data. And in times like these, you really need detailed data. Working with summary data is the enemy of good decision making. So you need to be able to drill down to the detail, and that data needs to be very up to date. You can't use last week's data in the kind of environment we're in today. So you need the ability to handle very large volumes of data. You need to be able to get that data in real time or near real time, and you need to give visibility to decision makers all the way down to the detail. You cannot make decisions across large geographies. If you look in the US, the way the pandemic has impacted New York City is very different than how it's impacted San Diego, or very different than how it's impacted Chicago. And so you have to have decision making that is really precision decision making that only happens if you have access to detailed data.
So you've kind of already alluded to the role of real-time data in this case in terms of managing disruptions and breakdowns. So I'll move to the next question actually, which is, what are the key tools that your customers are looking for to manage through this crisis, in addition to just having that detailed data, in terms of analytics or optimization, and of course real-time visibility? What have you picked up on in this context?
Many of our customers have constructed, they call them data war rooms. So they construct these kind of, I'll call them dashboards that give visibility to the data. And of course, these war rooms are virtual war rooms because people are distributed all over, all over the country, all over the world in some cases. And we want them looking at the same data. So a single source of truth for decision-making in an organization which you construct a data war room. They're not going to be in the same physical room. So you have visibility to the data. You have the ability to look at the data in a visual way. You have the ability to do what if analysis. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? No one knows exactly what's going to happen in the future. So you have to do scenario planning. You have to look at worst case and best case and, hope for the best and, plan for the worst and be able to adjust very, very quickly. So these data war rooms, they understand what is happening as it's happening. You don't get yesterday's data and look at it today. You look at today's data today, and you look at it as the events are unfolding, and you create event detectives to understand when disruptions are happening and give the tools to decision makers in order to intervene. Now, decision makers might be software decision makers, or they might be human decision makers. So we have to also open up our minds to what is a decision maker in this world of, real-time decisioning and disruptions happening all the time, and things aren't behaving as we're used to having them behave.
So I actually related to that. We find, and unfortunately, that perhaps some of the, best optimized systems and best optimized networks for normal conditions are not necessarily as resilient as one would like them to be. Are you seeing sort of anything along those lines where some of your customers might have had difficulty perhaps implementing on some of the previously optimized networks that they might have?
It's certainly the case that if you hyper optimize your supply chain and took all of the sort of buffer out, which of course reduces costs, makes you more profitable and so on, those are all good things to do. When a disruption like this happens, it's harder to adjust. And I think the hyper optimization is a good thing as long as you can evolve how you optimize as the conditions change. And so what we've seen is the organizations that did that hyper optimization, they know how to do it. They have an advantage, but they only can sustain the advantage if they can evolve the optimization techniques. And the only way to do that is by having access to detailed data. Because when you hyper optimize to these pre-computed balance scorecards and key performance indicators, you only know how to manage to those, but then the underlying conditions change, and what used to be the right KPIs to look at in the old world might not be the right KPIs to look at in the new world. And so you have to be able to adjust and evolve. So those skill sets for optimization are highly valuable, and the organizations that know how to do that are going to win, but they're only going to win on a sustainable basis if they can also adapt. So there's optimization, but there's also adapt. That's the key.
So many of your customers have made significant investments in hardware, software, systems to capture and leverage big data in their operational decision-making, including supply chain management. Yet others perhaps may not have been as aggressive in adopting and deploying data technologies and data science, analytics in their day-to-day operations. Can you see, from your vantage point, a marked difference in how those that have made these investments are in fact coping with the current disruption versus those that have not? For instance, we've talked to some folks, again, who are on the front lines in terms of running, transportation system network supply chains. They say, really, this is not about data for us. It's been more about people. It's not about technology. It's all about people and how we communicate and how you sort of interact with folks. So would you say that those who have invested are better prepared, and is this materially being felt, experienced by your customers? And perhaps if you have some examples here, those would be welcome.
Sure. So you talked about investments in hardware, software, and data. I would say actually today, a lot of our customers, they don't invest in hardware because they're deploying in the cloud-based environments. And so actually, the investments they have are really more CapEx than OpEx in the old world. And now in the new world, in cloud, it's really OpEx. So the investment profile changes a little bit, right? So yes, of course, you're investing in software, but even the software licenses that we provide to most of our customers are not investments per se and CapEx model. They're sort of new subscription-based models and so on. So investing in data is, did you capture the data? Do you have access? Are you providing access to the detailed data? Did you invest in the tools to visualize the data and build predictive models and so on? Those are all important investments to make. But I will tell you that investment in data is not just about technology. It's about investing in a culture of data, a culture of data-driven decision-making, a culture of data literacy. These are as important as the investments in the technology itself. The CEO of one of our customers, he has on his desk plaque, you know, "In God we trust, all others bring data," which is a very famous Deming quote, who was one of the original sort of data thinkers and in the industry, really before there was a data industry. And so we absolutely see a big difference. Fact-based decision-making using data is going to be more successful than making decisions based on the gut feeling in your stomach. Because the gut feeling in your stomach is based on your experience. And in this world, a lot of experience is actually not relevant to the situation we're in today. Nobody, unless they were alive in 1918, have been, you know, have ever experienced a global pandemic of this scale. So we've got to make decisions based on data. And I'll give you a specific example of one company who has invested over many years that I've worked with personally for over 10 years, is LATAM Airlines. So it's the largest airline in Latin America. They've got a very big network in that geography. And in the pre-COVID days, the vast majority of their revenue was passenger revenue. And I will tell you that cargo was the, I'll say, ugly stepsister. That yes, of course we did it, but I'll tell you that today their passenger revenue isn't anywhere near what it used to be. I'm not going to talk about specific numbers, but we can imagine all airlines are running, you know, less than 10% what they do. I'm not talking about LATAM particularly, but the industry as a whole, right? And so based on the access they have to the detailed data, and not just the data, but the culture of data-driven decision-making, they're able to have access to the detailed data and pivot their business to shift, okay, well, actually the cargo business is very healthy. In fact, it's, you know, even healthier than it was before the pandemic. And so how do you realign the routes? How do you make different aircraft choices? How do you do the prediction of what capacity you need on what routes? It's very different in a passenger-dominated world versus in a cargo-dominated world. But because they have detailed data, not summary data, they have detailed data and they have tools in order to do prediction, they are able to pivot on this and make good business decisions. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy for any airline right now, but I would say that they are in a much stronger position to come out of this in a healthy way than airlines that maybe were less sophisticated about, you know, detailed decision, fact-based decision-making, and the kind of analytic capabilities to do prediction, not just report on what happened yesterday, but to predict what's going to happen in the future and what are we going to do about it? What interventions are we going to make? And to do that learning very quickly, right? And we're not using data from last year, we're using data from the last hour. And that makes a big difference on the kind of decisions that you can make in this industry. I remember I was actually working with Qantas at the time of the SARS disruption, which is a much more regional disruption going back almost 20 years ago. And I remember Jeff Dixon making this quote that, you know, the aviation industry is never dull, but in the last year, it's been a lot more interesting than I would ever like it to be. And I think that's a situation that the transportation logistics industry is in today. And I know that at Qantas, the access to detailed data and being able to, you know, they accelerated the rate at which they brought data into their ecosystem. Again, this is almost 20 years ago, and real-time analytic ecosystems were a, you know, rare thing back then. And so they made some big investments to accelerate the rate at which they brought data into their ecosystem. and they were able to make much better decisions than, let's say, the other airline in Australia at that time was called Ansett. They are no longer there. And I would argue that part of the reason that Qantas survives and Ansett doesn't survive is because Qantas was smarter about using data. There was a very interesting study done by a guy named Eric Brynjolfsson at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he studied organizations who use data for decision-making versus those who used, I'll say, the gut of the stomach, or more sort of, I'll say, less sophisticated uses of data just for KPI reporting and so on. And what he found is that the organizations who use data to drive decision-making were making 4 to 6% higher profitability than other organizations. I'm not talking about revenue, I'm talking about profitability. That's a big number when you talk about this going to the bottom line of the business.
Absolutely. In fact, speaking of airlines, in one of our roundtables, we did speak to United Airlines in particular. And
also
again,
a Teradata customer.
And again, a similar story, of course, in terms of just readjusting to deal with cargo. And in this current environment, they cannot put enough capacity out there. There's so much demand. It's going through the roof for air cargo. And they're having to, again, in real time, essentially, try to replan their network just now to meet the need.
The routes are different, the aircraft choices are different, lots of things that you have to change based on the data, right? If you don't have access to the detailed data of where that cargo is coming from and where it's going and what the refrigeration requirements are and all those kinds of things, you can't pull it off.
So let's say you get that 3 a.m. call. One of your customers calls you, overwhelmed with COVID-19 related issues around supply chains, logistics, their business, and asks, Teradata, what do you have for me that can help me now to deal with these issues? What would you offer?
Well, I guess first I should say, I'm the CTO, so I'm not in sales. And so the first thing I would offer to do, quite frankly, is listen. Listen to the customer, understand what it is, what is the problem that they're having, right? Or is it a capacity issue? Is it an optimization issue? Is it a cost issue? What are the issues that they're having? You gotta listen, right? I like the Einstein quote about, solving the world's problems in an hour. You spend 55 minutes figuring out what the problem is, and then you spend 5 minutes solving it, right? So you gotta listen. Don't jump to conclusions. Look at the data, listen to the data, understand what the problems are, start diagnosing, understanding what those problems are, and then you can, we can offer solutions about how to, this dashboard or that dashboard or this real-time intervention or this machine learning algorithm. We've got lots of those things. But the first thing you do is listen. Listen with empathy for that industry, not generic listening, but with an understanding of that industry, the problems that they're likely to be facing in light of this pandemic, these very unusual circumstances. You got to listen. And listening is listening to the person talk, but also listen to their data talk. The data will tell you where it is that you can focus. And the old adage is never let a good crisis go to waste. If there's a crisis, there's opportunity. So find where is the opportunity. So we're working with a very large rental car network, multinational player, and they're trying to figure out, as not a lot of people are renting cars right now, how can they repurpose those vehicles and use them for other kinds of things. So listen to what are the opportunities and how you can use data to create new products, new pricing models, et cetera, to help them reinvent their own business. Part of what you need to do in a crisis is reinvent for the new normal. Things are not going to go back to the way they were. There will be a new normal.
So the current crisis has probably brought out, again, a greater role, I guess, that technology-enabled services can play. A lot of what we're doing is virtual, and a lot of the transactions are contactless, and so a lot of that has been eliminated from normal operations. Do you foresee these changes resulting perhaps in more permanent changes to the transportation and logistics industry? And I know that's not your exclusive focus, but
I absolutely see that, right? if you look at even a personal example, my mother had never shopped online before this COVID crisis, right? I mean, my mother's 80 years old, okay, right? So she walks down to the grocery store and she shops online, and she walks down to the local mall and she shops online and so on, and doesn't shop online, she shops in person. Now she shops online because she's, by the way, not allowed to leave the facility where she lives. So, you know, we taught her how to shop online and where to go and so on. And actually she's starting to like it. Right. So she is saying, wow, this is actually very convenient and less hassle. And actually, in a lot of things, I can get even, you know, better prices than what I was getting. And after this crisis is over, she's going to continue to shop online. Maybe not for everything, but she will continue to shop online for some things. And that's going to have an impact on the supply chain, right? Because now all those people that got used to shopping online, they're going to expect delivery to their doorsteps, whereas before they were going to the grocery store to purchase those things. If you look at other parts of transportation industry, you know, I think about all these virtual meetings that I'm having right now, you know, with Moscow and Johannesburg and Sydney and Santiago de Chile and New York City and Chicago. And before, somebody would have, you know, okay, we want to have a meeting to brainstorm on this thing and say, well, okay, I'm going to be on the East Coast in 2 weeks and I can swing through Manhattan and we can have that meeting. And now we can have the meeting this afternoon. We can have it tomorrow. We don't have to wait till the next time I get on a plane and so on. And so I know this is the passenger side of transportation industry, but that's also going to change, and it's going to create a new normal relative to the mix of, you know, cargo revenue versus passenger revenue. I absolutely believe that the aviation industry is going to have some big impact due to new norms being set by the virtual infrastructure that we're creating today for people to collaborate and interact.
So, Stephen, you've been one of the early advocates within Terra Data and indeed the data analytics community to see the potential of widespread use of AI in corporations. And we know that when you have, you know, a lot of historical data to train AI models, they can perform beautifully and effectively to support forecasting, resource allocation, etc. What do you do when you have a disruption? You mentioned earlier that historical data is probably not going to be of much use to me today. How useful is AI going to be to you in this environment where things are rapidly unfolding?
So this goes back to one of your earlier questions about, you know, companies that might have used these kind of machine learning algorithms to hyper optimize their network and so on. And then when changes happened, those algorithms that they had built are no longer performing because the historical data is no longer a good prediction of what's going to happen in the future. So you have to use machine learning in a way that is continuous learning, not supervised learning where you train the model and then you say, okay, now I'm done. Now I'm going to deploy the model, and you assume that nothing changes, right? That's no good. And so and I would say, by the way, this is true even before the pandemic, but now it really puts the emphasis on this point. Machine learning, really, if you're doing it well, is continuous learning. It's not supervised learning as an event. And then deployment of the model, and every 6 months you go back and retune the model or something. That's the old way of doing things. What we used to call data mining looks like that. But the whole point of machine learning is you're automating the learning process. So of course you're going to have data scientists involved in sort of figuring out what features to put in the feature repository and things like that. I'm not saying that you're going to get rid of the humans, but you have to automate for continuous learning. And we'll use different techniques, for example, reinforcement learning, where you use non-labeled data sets. Labeled data sets are highly labor intensive, and it's very hard to adapt very quickly, whereas reinforcement learning does not require that, that level of, I'll say, labor, and so you have a much better balance between, you know, sort of automation and using historical data where you can explore new territory with the reinforcement learning, and learn by trying and getting it wrong, right? Making mistakes is part of the learning. So you get it wrong, but you learn from those things that you did wrong, and then you get better and better and better. So reinforcement learning kind of has this balance around exploring new ideas. We're still sort of having a basis on the experience of what's been successful in the past, but you have continuous learning, not a one-time event.
So you're
right?
saying, sorry, go ahead. You're saying that the current crisis, I guess, is really long enough that in fact now our tools are able to get retrained to learn so that they are useful in guiding through, I guess, guiding us out of that crisis.
Well, it depends a lot. When you say your tools, it depends on tools and methodology. I would say a lot of what people are doing out there probably isn't good enough, because they treat the training, the supervised learning, as an event. It's like you sent your kid to university, you sent them to school at 5 years old, and they spent the next 20 years going through, primary school and secondary school and university. And then at 25 years old, they come out with their master's degree or whatever. And then you think the learning is done. Well, if the learning is done after you get a master's degree, you're in big trouble, right? You've just got the foundation for the learning. And we need to think of machine learning in the same way. Yes, of course, you're going to do supervised learning to bootstrap the model and so on, but you've got to continue to learn. So you've got to build in the capability for continuous learning. You've got to continue to get the data in on a near real-time basis and feed that into the model and automatically adjust the learnings and the behaviors and the interventions coming out of your machine learning infrastructure.
So, as CTO of Teradata, what sort of new and, what do you have on your horizon, essentially? What new and rapidly advancing technologies do you see that have potential of lasting impact? We've mentioned AI and machine learning. Do you see blockchain technologies, for example, being much of a factor? Is there anything else that we should be aware of that is really going to make a big difference in terms of, say, supply chain logistics and that kind of domain?
Certainly machine learning is the big gorilla, machine learning and deep learning and so on. I must admit, I tend not to use the AI term, because I think that's become a bit of a marketing buzzword that means everything and nothing at the same time. But deep learning specifically, with continuous learning capabilities is a big deal for optimizing on a continuous basis the business and supply chain and logistics, et cetera. Blockchain certainly does have a big play, because with blockchain, you can use this technology, the distributed ledger technology, to basically track the lineage and the provenance of any good or any raw material, all the way from seed to shelf, using the blockchain technology. And so that means that if you have product recalls, you can do them on a much more narrow targeted basis, instead of having all the waste that happens with recalls today. And in this whole healthcare crisis, unfortunately, there's going to end up being a lot of abuse as vaccinations get released and treatments get released and so on in pharmaceutical drugs. There will be fraud, right? We know that from past experience. And blockchain allows me, again, to have the lineage and the provenance to reduce the fraud that takes place in the supply chain. So absolutely think that it makes a big difference. And the ability to take the machine learning and do it in real time rather than sort of batch scoring, this is also a big deal. So it's, taking one step further. So I tend to focus on how do we extend our existing technology to the next step, to the next step, to the next step. We can talk about technologies like quantum computing, which is very exciting stuff, but this is not going to be relevant for most logistics and supply chain companies in the next 5 years. So that's a much further out thing. And that's more about how can you take these, very, very hard, complex optimization problems and do them on a continuous real-time basis, even though there's exponential compute involved to be able to do this in, a second time frame. And it allows you to completely rethink the methods that you use for continuous optimization and decision-making and intervention in the supply chain.
Okay, great. Well, Stephen, this has been extremely informative. I want to thank you for your time. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
I guess, you know, as you said in introduction, I'm a data guy. And I think that, you know, the thread through this discussion has been, how does, you know, data help you make better decisions in times of crisis? Especially, actually, it makes a bigger difference in times of crisis than in normal times, because in normal times, your normal business processes will generally do the right thing. It's when when something unexpected happens where you really need the data to make the right decisions. Mm-hmm. But there's this analogy that I hear all the time that, you know, data is the oil of the 21st century. I hate this term, right? I hate this phrase, right? Data is way better than oil, right? When you burn oil, you cause pollution, and you use up the resource. Data, the more you use it, the better it gets. The quality goes up, your understanding goes up, and when you use it, it doesn't go away. And so data is way better than oil. And I would like never hear this phrase again. I think The Economist was the one that originally put that in print. And really, data is way better than oil, and is the basis for competitive business in the 21st century.
Stephen, thank you very much. I want to, again, wish you all the best, and hope to see you at some point soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Yossi, you're director of MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, where you've launched a highly successful global supply chain management graduate program. You founded 5 companies at the cutting edge of where technology meets logistics, all of which have been successfully acquired by major players. And literally, you wrote the book on resilience. You're a highly regarded thought leader, entrepreneur, visionary, educator, and you've seen supply chains and disruptions from the inside. You know, you've helped build resilient enterprises. You've faced several disruptions in the past, man-made, natural, etc. The question is, what is different this time in terms of impact on supply chains? And where are you seeing the greatest vulnerabilities? Is it at nodes, along links, unreliable suppliers, shortages of critical goods, components? You know, what's different? What's your take on what's going on now?
Let's talk about all of these issues, and you'll have to remind me if I forget. So first of all, the combination of both supply and demand. We had supply problem before when we had let's say Japan or Thailand floods. We had demand problem when we had 1208, 2008, 2009 recession was a demand problem. Now we have both, and on top of it, we have transportation problem. We have lack of transportation capacity, hard to go to ports. Some countries want airplanes that come in for the cruise to be there for 14 days. It's a whole, some ports don't allow certain ships to come in. So there's a huge lack of capacity in the air, in the ground, and so forth, in certain countries. So it's kind of hit on all parts of supply chains. Let's say we should really separate between the medical supplies, especially in the United States, and other, and what I call other supply chain, normal supply chain. So let's talk about medical supplies. There were and I think a lot of it is tied to leadership in this case, leadership at the political level. So we see countries that reacted. Let's start with the fact that China clearly at the beginning did not react well. They were hiding it. They were, prosecuting people who were sounding the alarm, even didn't tell their own people. But apparently the U.S. intelligence community knew about it, and not only the U.S. intelligence communities. Let me give you, we know about countries that handled it well, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, Norway, Denmark. I'm particularly familiar with Israel. I was just looking this morning at the Israel hospitals, and they have 101 people in ICU and 3,000 ventilators standing by. Why? because starting in December, they started to order ventilators and PPEs because the relation between the intelligence community and the government is very close. So they listen. What we see in other countries is this was not the case. I'm not trying to, it's not a blame game. People, we have regimes that are working in certain way, aside from one particular country that really should be blamed. This is our own, but aside from this. Now, let's go back to supply chains. Clearly, we had a case of two things that converge in the medical supply chain. One, very large dependency on China. And second, starting with the Obama administration not having the safety stock of medical supply. The safety stock started during the Clinton administration. Think about like the petroleum, the strategic petroleum.
Yeah.
It was exactly the same thing. With a large safety stock of supply. The idea started the Clinton administration. Actually, the Bush administration built it up. They had, of course, 9/11 happened to them, and several other things, and they built a huge capacity and huge safety stock of medical supplies. The Obama administration brought it down completely. The Obama administration had several cases where they had to use H1N1 and others, but they did not rebuild it. They felt that it's enough to get committees together that will think about it, so they did not rebuild it. And of course, during the Trump administration, not only didn't build a medical supply, but many scientists left the government because some of them were fired, some organizations were just decimated. So we lost even the capacity to think clearly about it. So this is what happened, and we can talk about how to fix it, but this is kind of what happened. What happened in other areas, in high-tech, automotive, other areas, it started with a supply problem when Chinese factories and then other Asian factories were closing down. But the biggest impact is now the demand problem. We can get around the supply problem. We can get around the supply problem in the sense that, for example, General Motors is now running its ventilator factory for a small part of GM, it's, several hundred people, but it learns how to run a factory with social distancing, with putting plexiglasses between workstations, with taking temperature that everybody comes in. You learn how to work with this. Mm-hmm. So the supply will be there. It may be limited, it may be higher cost because of we're not going to be able to have as many people at the plant at one time. We may have to run 2 shifts instead of 1 shift, or 3 shifts instead of 2 shifts, because we have less people on every shift. Supply is going to be there. So the biggest problem now is demand. The biggest problem now that companies are facing in whether they, unless they are servicing people at home. So for example, if you sell laptops, you're actually okay. People buy laptops. You cannot buy Logitech cameras, the one that I'm talking to right now, because they are out of stock. Everybody wants to put them on the machines. So if you are not selling, PPEs on stuff for home, or if you're not Netflix or Zoom, then most of the economy is not in good shape because demand is down. So, and again, aside from food, of course, is going well. But I don't know what will happen to automobile factories, for example. How many people are going to buy refrigerators? How many people are buy, general white good or toys or whatever? Because not only, the problem is we are going into a severe recession right now. And in a severe recession, people don't buy a lot of stuff. In the last recession, GM had to be rescued. They were going bankrupt. Yeah. Chrysler had to be forced into a merger with Fiat. Ford just by very small margins skated, going down, and they had a good line of credit just before. They were very lucky. So now we have a demand problem, and as fixed some lower capacity in some of the warehousing and plants. So it's something that we have never seen before. And
let's talk about resilience.
Yes.
How would you define resilience in this context? And what are the key characteristics of a resilient supply chain?
Okay, so by the way, when I define resilience, as you know, you're an engineer too, is the ability of a material to retain its former shape. It's coming from material science. After deformation, to retain its former shape. Here we are talking about the ability of a corporation or a manufacturer to come back to the to retain back its level of manufacturing, level of service, whatever the KPI is, but go back to normal and even beyond. So that's the essence of resilience, getting back to business in this context. The question is, what do resilient companies do that is different from companies that are not so successful?
Mm-hmm.
And this is aside from the fact that resilient companies are better prepared. So let's start with better preparation. Better preparation is, first of all, now very important, mapping the supply chain. Understand not only where you're, as far up the tiers as you can go. It's not easy to go to tier 4, 5, and 6, but tier 1 and 2 possibly you can find out where the plants are. Not where they send the check, not where the address in the SAP system is, which is usually headquarters. That's where you send the check. No, no, no. You need to know where the plant of the suppliers are and where your plants are. And then there are companies like Resilink and others that put the bill of material on top of this. So now they know that supplier X is building parts that go into product ABC that go into customers 1, 2, 3. So if something happened to this supplier, if this area of the country is suddenly closed, there's a second wave, it's closed, or something else happens, you now know immediately. And by the way, there are services, these companies are also tied to services that give immediate alert if something happened. Not only pandemic and closure and fire and flood and whatever happened. So you know immediately that something happens, and you know that this plant may be out of commission for a while. But the interesting is you immediately know which customers and which of your product and which of your customers are affected by this. So now you can do the following. You can immediately go and start prioritizing customers. You can start prioritizing product. I'll say, you know, in many cases, the same part goes to several products and go to multiple customers. You can start making a decision. And you don't just go to the most profitable customer. The idea is to have the decision protocols ahead of time. So you know that it's beyond, of course, customer profitability, product profitability gets into it, but you have to realize that you may ruin customer relationship for decades if you do it wrong. So you have to be also seen as fair and open. And whatever you do, I give the example in one of my books about what happens with the Thailand floods, that Western Digital was the leading disk drive manufacturer was hit, and Seagate took the lead because they were not affected. So they started doing auctions for and an auction, you know, people say, economists will tell you that auction is the most efficient way to do it. It's, of course, it is efficient because it gives the stuff to the customer who needs it most, which economists would love, but the customer saw it as profiteering. And the minute that the flood was over, everybody went back to Western Digital. So they regained the number one. So you have to think about not only what economists are saying is best, but how your customers will perceive it. Also, in sometimes we saw that the small customers who live in small communities will get the part because otherwise it would devastate the community. So there are lots of other considerations that go into prioritizing. Then you have to think about how to prioritize suppliers, because some suppliers will go, we know from, the beer game, that if orders go down at the retail level, what you happen in the 3rd and 4th tier suppliers may be a lot worse. And some of them, maybe some supplier will get out of business. So you have to, as the OEM or the largest company in the chain, you have to think about everybody will be looking to conserve cash and manage for cash flow rather than for profit. But now you have to think if you will, lengthen payables because you want to conserve cash, you are putting your suppliers in danger. So you have to think of which supplier you do it with and which supplier you don't. With supplier, you maybe extend even your credit to them because they cannot get credit right now. We expect a credit crunch right now, just like 2008. So you have to think about what you need. 2008, some companies even bought equity in their supplier in order to support them. They did a lot of things. Mm-hmm. So another thing that resilient companies do is work and is get ready for coming out of the mm-hmm. So first of all, they're prepared. They set up before I talk about how they're prepared, let me talk about how I see the next 3, 6, 9 months evolving. Mm-hmm. And people are talking about a V-type coming out of this, an L-type coming to the U-type coming to the W-types coming, none of the above. I call it a whack-a-mole recovery. Whatever, whack-a-mole, the game that something comes up, something comes here, something comes here. Because what I think will happen, different regions of the world will see another flare-up, and they'll close it down, and then it will down for 2 months, and it will reopen, and then it will happen here, and then it will happen here. Mm-hmm. So when I talk to a lot of companies, we talk about setting up tiger teams to be on the ground, looking for what's happening in these places, and try to get very quickly a sense from social media, for looking at hospital, for visiting large suppliers to see their HR practices, if they do social distancing and masks and contact tracing and all this, because if they don't, they're in danger. And you might want right now to think about what happened when this supplier cannot. We saw what happened in some of the big meat plants in North Dakota, South Dakota, I don't remember, Smithfield plant. They didn't keep any social distancing, and hundreds of workers got sick, and they had to close the plant. So you don't want to be in this. Amazon has problems in its warehouses because people are too close to each other, and now they're trying to get people away. So what will happen is the capacity and the throughput will go down because you have to keep people away. And anyway, I can keep talking about it more and more. I probably don't cover everything.
So our focus today, in part, is on the role that technology, and more specifically data-related technologies, can play, and indeed has played, in making our freight transportation networks and supply chains more resilient. Where do you see the most significant impacts? For example, is it in real-time visibility, reducing some of the unpredictability and variability through advanced notice, being faster, more open, having more open communication, collaboration? Could you maybe tell us
Sure.
about your experience in that regard?
Sure. First of all, visibility has been a quest for a long time, and we've become somewhat better at it. But the problem, there's a fundamental problem with visibility that we don't hear too many talk about, in that there's real-time visibility can be only limited by structure, because the idea that we'll have visibility along the supply chain, we'll see what tier 4, tier 3, tier 2, tier 1 are doing and getting to us, is a pipe dream, I think, because a miner who's tier 10 in the supply chain does not have any idea where his aluminum is going. So you don't know this aluminum going to you, and if something happened to him, impacts you or whatever. And by the way, why would he give you visibility? You are not his customer, you're not tied to him. So I think it's very difficult to dream about visibility very upstream in the supply chain. You can go tier 1, sure. And of course, we are going to tier 1. Automotive companies have visibility into transportation, into the plant. So, and they have visibility, could be better. It's amazingly not 100% for automobiles that go out, because there's no reason that you would not be able to follow an automobile all the way to the dealership and to your home, but it's still spotty. But in any case, we've been working a lot. There will be more. In general, there are several IoT development in sensor technology that people keep working on better, smaller, and cheaper sensors. Mm-hmm. And as we get those, as long as we can identify a batch in the upstream that comes into the product, yes, we can follow it. In many cases, we cannot even know. So this is one thing. An area that I see most of the impact of COVID is in robotics, in supply chain. I think that we already see warehouse robotic be an explosive function. Many companies are putting robotics into their warehouse, into the plant. But now warehouse robotic, in supply chain is a big thing. You can think about autonomous vehicles, same thing, autonomous robots, autonomous vehicles to the extent possible. This has regulatory issue, drones. A lot of these are taking people out of the supply chain, but so with less contact. Another thing that we'll see, it's really old technology, but people have not adopted it. It's just digital paperwork. I mean, we still have cases. Most cases, the driver comes into the plant, they have replicates of stuff, gives it to somebody, they sign, they take it back. This cannot continue during the pandemic. Today, we can. I mean, we having still paper is just unthinkable. As an aside, for example, I'm sure your university is doing it. MIT is going to do online commencement, and people get the degree on their phone. We've been doing it for several years. For several years now, for 4 or 5 years, it was an option. Now, that's the only way we are doing it. So you get out of the business of touching paper, giving paper to each other. So I see robotic and getting out of anything that requires close contact as areas that will that are developing as a result of this pandemic.
So I think I know your answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So what are the key tools that companies that you're familiar with are looking for to manage their supply chains for the crisis? Is analytics, optimization? Again, we talked about visibility, or really is it more about intuition and gut feeling rather than analytics?
What happens is the following. As you know, I'm sure in your university as well as in mine, and every other one, people are talking a lot about AI and machine learning, and a lot of hopes in machine learning were that we'll be able to better forecast. I think the response of the virus will be, are you kidding me? The fact that you have a lot of data from the last 3 years to train your machine learning on was useless. I mean, nothing prepared you for it. So when you have structural changes in the demand and supply, none of these models can help you. It comes up to people looking at this and using gut to make perfect decisions. Now, we see an area that we do see analytic and optimization, and this is with quick network design. We see companies that are, given what's going on, and getting even ready to do more of this in a whack-a-mole recovery, trying to see how quickly, say, models that are there and they updated in real time with the data and which ports are open, how long the lead time is, which suppliers open, which market they can sell to. They're rejigging their network, the total network, and decide which factory does what on close to real time. So this we see analytic and optimization absolutely in the network design area. Forecasting, not so much. As Fauci said, I love it. He said, we live on the virus time. It's not, the virus will decide how things go. So we can decide whatever we want. It is something that is so outside everything that we know, that is, you know, the fact that it's so contagious and so when asymptomatic people can carry it, it's so different than anything else. You never had a case in the flu when people asymptomatic would start and infect each other. Now we have, who knows who is this? As somebody said, I go in the street and I assume that everybody is infected. It's the only safe assumption. So that's where we are.
So are you seeing already that in this guacamole recovery that you mentioned, then are you seeing that the focus of how companies are using and applying optimization and analytics sort of changing in the face of COVID, or they're not quite there yet?
You know, there are companies and there are companies, of course. You see advanced companies who are doing it. Basically, what they're doing, they are putting emphasis on fast solutions, even if it's really funny because you start thinking like an optimizer, because you think, okay, I'm getting a good lower bound, a good upper bound, I'm somewhere here, that's a good enough solution. So the important is to get it fast. So it's we see this, the bottleneck is feeding the data, understanding what's going on, putting the real data. And then there can be so many mistakes because people are working hard that the one thing that they're looking at it. People with experience are looking at it. Does this structure make sense? Does this structure answer the situation? So yeah, we see people, but you know, with all the hype and everything that you and I teach our students, there are very few companies who are really sophisticated and really do it well. So there are some, of course, but most companies, it's now that everything that the usual tools are not even available, it's done by gut and by experience.
Okay, so again, I think you've already alluded to this, that there are companies and there are companies. And also you talked about some being more prepared than others. And we know that many companies have made significant investments in hardware, software systems to capture and leverage big data in their operational decision-making, including supply chain management. Yet others perhaps have not been as aggressive in adopting and deploying these technologies and analytics in their day-to-day operations. Can you see a marked difference, I guess, in how those that have made these investments are coping with the current disruption versus those that have not? Are those who have invested better prepared? And is this materially being felt, experienced by companies you might be aware of? Any specific examples you care to give us?
Okay, so there's a little, for some of this, there's actually a little paradox. And the paradox is some companies in some processes became too dependent on the algorithms. And that was to their peril, actually, because they were not, it took them a while to understand that what the algorithm is spewing out is useless at this point. The company who did well are companies that had the algorithm, but also had the people who understood how the algorithm worked. So it's or had the consultant or the relationship to understand how the algorithm, it's not enough, especially when there's a structural change, to totally assume that I know, by the way, that retailers, I talked to several retailers in this area, they completely chucked out all the automatic ordering. Because at the beginning of the pandemic, they were ordering absolutely the wrong things. And they now look at what's going on and honestly, almost day to day, but certainly week to week, deciding what to order. And companies, the large retailers, totally automatic ordering. They were looking at the point of sale, making small changes. But now it became so large that the algorithm were not coping with it, actually. And some stuff was, not ordered at all. Some stuff was, it's supply problems. Some stuff had panic buying. Just everything was different. So companies, Star Market, Stop and Shop, by the way, mention companies, should be mentioned, hopefully. But so retailers, a lot of them went to ordering by just looking, taking the data from the point of sale, of course, but looking at what's happening, looking at what, reading the papers, where they see shortages, what's going on, and decide to order based on this. So we see this happening. The question is, you get the data and you have the ability to analyze the data. But at this point, because of the magnitude of the change, you have to look at it and see, does it make sense? And this is a skill that is beyond ability to run a computer program, just as it makes sense for the business. Companies who have people who understand the algorithm, who have the algorithm, understand the algorithm, and can at time override them are the companies who are doing well. So it's not, look, there are companies who are totally in fog. If they don't have the data, then in fact, if you don't have the ability to collect the data about what's going on in the marketplace, you're actually in a worse shape, of course, because you don't know even how to respond. You don't know what's going on in your market. You don't know. Clearly, I'm not even talking, it's kind of, in this day and age, not having the data, not being a good ability to analyze the data is a kiss of death. I mean, you're not going to be able to do anything. But in addition to having the data and the analytics, you need, for such large changes, you need the ability to look at it and say, does it make sense?
So one area where again, you had been a pioneer in terms of seeing the opportunities is in the area of third-party logistics and 3PLs. And what we're seeing today, in part, is a greater role, in fact, for the intermediaries in trying to meet, surges in demand in one area or another. So in this sense, I guess the current crisis has highlighted a greater role that some of these technology-enabled services can play. Do you foresee these resulting in perhaps more permanent changes to the transportation and logistics industry?
It depends if this third-party companies, third-party, fourth-party, whatever this intermediary will move beyond this crisis. It gives them, by the way, a unique opportunity to understand both the suppliers and the customers better, because everybody is talking to them now. The question is, can they leverage this later on to even more services and being more tied up to their to the customer suppliers, and not just coming back and saying, give me the order, I'll give you the trucks. Okay, they'll stay where they are, but it's an opportunity if they grab it to get further into both sides of the business and provide a lot more services, including consulting, including managing a lot of the logistics for the customers. They can do a lot more than just, and also something else. In many companies, you have several large companies have several supply chains for different type of products. And in many cases, they'll have different third party serving this. When you have something like this, you understand that everything is connected to everything. And a company who can move beyond working in one area of the business to understand we can work on other area of the business, there are connections between them. It's another opportunity to grow your business and get more stickiness into the supplier. So it's an opportunity. We'll see if they take it.
Okay. So in addition to automation and contactless transactions that you've mentioned, are there other new rapidly advancing technologies that have potential to have a lasting impact on supply chain resilience and operations? What about blockchain technologies? I know you already said you don't have much faith, I guess, in AI machine learning to deal with major disruptions. Other technologies that would come to mind.
Okay, let me first of all qualify this.
Okay.
I said absolutely AI machine learning in particular is not for forecasting. Is not good for this. A lot of people are using all the robotics that I was talking about is driven by AI.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's driven by, so of course there's a lot of areas AI machine learning still very relevant. We talk about autonomous vehicles, drones, whatever. There's a huge amount of AI in machine learning.
Of course.
Blockchain, it's to me, it's still a technology waiting for application. Yeah, we will have here and there small parts in documents in particular that can exchange documents that you can use blockchain. I mentioned before that MIT gives you on your phone the degree. It's in fact, it's a blockchain. It's done in the block. Okay. But it's so because you need the trust. So okay, so encryption and everything that goes with it. But the main thing that I want to say about it is that we should stop thinking about blockchain strategy, AI strategy, machine learning strategy, whatever the technology is. We don't think about spreadsheet strategy or mathematics strategy. We think about problems. And for some problems, AI can help. And some problem, it's an overkill, or a spreadsheet is fine. So rather than think about the method side, I always try to look and always try to understand the method so I'll have more quiver in my arrows in my quiver. but I'm trying not to focus on where this technology works. I'm not a supplier of technology. I'm trying to look at myself as a problem solver. So a company has a problem. What is the problem? When we have companies coming, you know, we have the supply chain exchange, you guys have something similar, a group of companies that we work with. When we do onboarding with a company, we spend a day with them and we think that what are the pain points? What are the problems? What are the challenges? Where are they going? We don't talk about technology. Once we understand this, we try to say, okay, this can be solved this way, this can be solved that way. So I think that this is how I like to look at it. And in terms of technology that will influence, we talk about robotics, autonomous vehicles, drones. I think that over time, 3D printing will have a large impact because it's becoming better and better, but it's still slow and limited in some areas. It is still used, by the way, widely now for prototyping, for ones we do things that are specialized, for sophisticated customization, clearly very good. Some people, GE is using aircraft engines at the rate of about 40,000 a year. That's nothing compared to Coca-Cola. You cannot do, you know, hundreds of millions of products a year with 3D printing. So it's not going to replace mass production, but it can replace a lot of other stuff. And we may have, I still don't think that if you want a toaster, you'll build it at home, but maybe you will be able to build it locally in a city, in a smaller factory. And so it will have a lot less parts and more just raw material that's coming to the, so this may have a significant change.
Having an impact at scale in a way. Yeah, definitely great. Well, Yossi, this has been extremely informative. Do you have any final thoughts for us and for our audience?
I would say yes. One of the challenges that we are having looking into the future when we go into significant recession is, are we stop even thinking about global warming? Because for people to buy items that are a little more expensive but done responsibly, it may look like, you know, good that they cannot afford. So that's one. Second, companies are started, you know, will be mostly in bad shape, and they're start thinking how to get out of it. They are not going to fund a lot of investments in things that do not bring immediate revenue, like being more socially responsible. So I think one of the challenges we come out of it is thinking about how to not to lose completely social and environmental responsibility. We don't want to see, because we have to cut costs, people going back to using slave labor and child labor, and people, you know, polluting local rivers. So it will be one of the challenges. I'm not sure how to deal with it. I'm just putting it as a challenge.
Well, Yossi, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure talking to you and learning from you. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Excellent. I see that we have Stephen here with us and Stephanie. I'm not sure if Yossi Sheffi is joining us as well, but we can. So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for participating with us in this roundtable. I see Professor Sheffi is here as well. So great. We have all three panelists today. Excellent. So we have received several questions during this, during the interviews, and our Senior Associate Director at the Transportation Center, Brett Johnson, will be asking or reading some of these questions and directing them to our various panelists, and then we will kind of interactively here join in these, in these points. So Brett, would you like to start with the first question that you have?
Sure thing. This first question we want to direct towards Professor Sheffi, and the question is, how would the disruptions of the past few months have been handled successfully or unsuccessfully if these technology solutions did not exist?
Could you tell us who the question is from when you have that information?
Yeah, we just have initials from for this one from AK.
Okay. So the question was about how did supply chain handle the disruption? That's a long answer, but first of all, some supply chains were hampered by starting with lack of supply. They couldn't do anything about it. Others with closed ports, not having enough airlift capacity. Right now, not having demand. Closures by government mandate in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. So on top of this, I would say that the one supply chain that I am amazed by in the US is the food supply chain. If you think about what happened to the food in the United States, and I don't know if other people covered it, I joined just at the last minute. I'm sorry, I was in another Zoom session, but to me, the fact that everything changed. Instead of going, the destination, have to go to supermarket instead of going to universities and offices and institutions, one. Second, people hardly, not too many people order fresh produce. They order, bread and cans and, pasta. So the type of stuff is changing. The big factories are not equipped to send 100% of their output to supermarket with the packaging that goes to, the 1 kilogram, half a pound package that go to the super, whatever it is. And on top of it, the media, as you know, in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the motto of the media, fear sells. So you have all these catastrophizing headlines. We are running out of food. We are running out of eggs. We are running out of meat. Guys, we are not running out of anything. It's actually, to me, pretty amazing how well supply chain people and supply chain company perform in this. When you don't have PPEs, there's only so much that you can do, right? You just don't have them. So it's not a question of supply chain, it's a question of availability. So the one thing where I think that I wrote a blog, I wrote a monthly influencer blog on LinkedIn, and I said that supply chain are also some of the unsung heroes because they make it work. And by the way, it's not only the planners and the people who run software, it's the people who go to the warehouse and driving the trucks. I mean, you need them. They're essential workers. And they go, and as we saw in some plants, the results when management did not keep good processes, we saw what happened in the Smithfield plant. We saw what happened in some warehouses. There was a Walmart store right here in Massachusetts that had a lot of infection. So on top of this, by the way, on top of all the problems, good companies that have that put distance between workers, that spread warehouse workers, have lower capacity now. They cannot, the throughput cannot be as good as before because they don't have enough people. And the cost is higher. When you have, one shift, you now have two shifts because you have half the people. And through all of this, as I said in so many, Bloomberg and so many interviews, the United States does not suffer from lack of protein. And it's not, the catastrophizing of the situation by the media is ridiculous, and it's what caused a lot of the panic buying.
Yeah. So part of the question, and this is, I'm addressing that to the, I guess, other panelists as well, if they'd like to chime in, was about, again, what people would have done without the technology. And then Professor Sheffi mentioned that, of course, they've done reasonably well under the circumstances, but without the technology that you've talked about, Stephen and Stephanie, how might things, have been different? Would you care to?
I think there's been a big difference between a pull model that is possible now because we've got the data in real time. We can understand the demand for products and where those products are needed and so on. And that data is informing decisions about where a product needs to go. In the old days, before the technology, it was much more of a push model. There'd be some plan and then there'd be products and we'd push them out to the retail stores and so on. And it was not a very adaptable model. and you push, and then eventually you'd realize, oh, we got too much inventory in these stores and not enough in these, and then you do rebalancing, and this just wouldn't work. So I think that a key is having this demand-driven model that is really made possible by access to data in real time, not last week's data, but the last hour's worth of data. That made a huge difference in the ability to, especially in grocery retailers, to get the right product to the right places.
Right. I will reiterate almost the same thing, and it might be a statement of the obvious, but I think we would have seen a lot more stockouts in stores. The grocery supply chain's ability to react in real time and get the right goods to the right stores when they needed them was enabled by new technologies. And that would not have been possible without them. And I think people would have felt it, right? They felt the stockouts when we were all panic buying. But when you went the next day, there were new supplies in those places. And so we got a lot of positive messaging around, hey, no need to worry, there will still be toilet paper there 2 days from now. And that would not have been possible without the real-time data that we have flowing through the supply chain today and some of these modern technologies.
So our next question, and Brett will again read that, is more from a public sector perspective. Brett, you want to take Krishnan's question?
Well, Hani, I was going to go in order what I've got here to keep it simple on my end. I wanted to redirect this one towards Stephen and ask, how are supply chain companies handling the cybersecurity issues that accompany increased data acquisition, data sharing, and remote access?
Well, when you have each participant in the supply chain only has visibility to a small piece, you can't make good decisions. So what we're seeing is that, for example, the more sophisticated retailers and working with data, they are providing access to their analytic ecosystems to their key suppliers. So for example, if I'm Procter & Gamble, I have access to data in Walmart's analytic ecosystem. And of course, you have to have the appropriate authentication and appropriate access controls and those things, but this is not a practice that just came up because of COVID. This has been around for the sophisticated retailers for a very, very long time. The whole point of vendor managed inventory. This is one of the ways that Walmart used data to change the retail industry 2 decades ago, more than that actually. And so the ability to share data is something that is inherent to an efficient supply chain. You've got to share data, and also with your transportation network and all up and down the supply chain. And of course we need to protect that data, but it's a solved problem. I'm not saying that cybersecurity we should sort of roll over and not pay attention, but it's not something that is new to the crisis that we're in now.
So would any of our other speakers care to chime in on the cybersecurity issue here?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
Okay, then we're going to go to that public sector question, and we're going to, Stephanie, we're going to lead on, or look to you to this one.
Okay.
The question is from Krishnan Vishwanthan. One of the biggest gaps for in the public sector is availability of last mile freight data in terms of flows, modes, commodity type. How can we, the public sector, I imagine, access or purchase data for use by the public sector, even at slightly higher spatial or temporal resolution, to help with infrastructure decisions? I can repeat it if you need me to.
Good question. There was a lot in there, and no need to repeat it, but let me know if when I answer it, there are things that we're missing. And basically what I understand is it's an interest in the public sector being able to access some of the data that individual companies have access to about themselves to get more visibility into last mile. And I will say we don't sell data to the public sector. That's not available. But as part of the crisis, we have partnered with folks to make some of this data available to the public sector. So an example is we worked with the city of New York to analyze food being sent into the city and the boroughs that it was going to, so that they knew where they had food supply shortages. And we got permission from our customers to share that data and did it in an aggregated form. But that gave them insight to where they could expect supply issues and set policies accordingly. And so that's a minor example and well, major for New York, but one specific example that came up as part of this. And I think as a result, we'll explore that option more, recognizing that there is value in being able to level up some of this data and glean more macro insights from what we're seeing in our product.
Can I add something here?
Sure.
We have a partnership with FEMA run by, Jared Gunsel of our center. And 3 times a week, we look at tracking flows from from DAT, from everybody, look at contracts and what's going on. And we also do, it's focus on New England and the East Coast, the Northeast, I would say, and focus on, because that's where, or focus on area where the infection is still high. And the idea is, when should FEMA start opening its own warehouses? Where does the commercial supply chain works? Look, we know that there are lots, we know where there are the big food warehouses in this country. You look at Eastern Pennsylvania, we know where they are. And you look at tracking flow from there to New York, from there to Boston, from there to Philadelphia, from other places. We also do every other day, we have a panel of executives in retail outlet, and we try to verify from them what they say and try to put together the data. And every other day, we do a report that goes from FEMA directly to the White House. Now, what happens here is there's a trusted party, which in this case is MIT and FEMA, working with FEMA. We don't get individual company data. We can't, we don't have it. But you get flows and you get some verification from the receiver side. And just as an example, when was it? 4 weeks ago or so, we raised the alarm that people who work in truck stops should be considered essential workers. Within 24 hours, the White House released it. They were made to be essential workers. I don't know if it was 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, whatever, but we identified that something is a problem. Put it immediately in the FEMA report. So the answer is, if you have a trusted third party works with, in this case, a government agency, and there's a crisis, which helps companies work together. I'm not sure if this will stay after the fact.
And I think that's the bigger question is, yeah, could that model somehow be adapted to planning under, quote, normal conditions? And that's...
I think the fact that we are in a crisis helps break a lot of bureaucratic hurdles.
Mm-hmm.
So,
indeed. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Well, I've certainly seen from a Teradata perspective, we have a lot of customers that we do business with in the healthcare industry, both on the provider side, like HCA, for example, as well as on the payer side, Blue Cross Blue Shield plans and Cigna, et cetera, et cetera. And we're also work with Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So we've got a lot of the different pieces. And we're part of a consortium where everybody's, not so focused on how do we compete, but how do we actually cooperate and collaborate in order to create better outcomes. And as was said earlier, crisis creates a difference in focus, which allowed certain things to happen around data sharing to make sure that the pharmaceuticals and PPE got to the right places where they were needed and so on. better than it could have been, let's say. I'm not saying that it was perfect, but without the data, it would have been much worse. And we also do work with basically all of the major PBMs, the pharmaceutical benefits managers. So sort of making sure that all the right pieces are coming together so that the right supplies for delivering healthcare in a crisis were happening. Without data sharing, it would be very difficult for people to understand where that demand was going to happen, because these are not retrospective models. These are predictive models of what's going to happen in the near future, so you can sort of skate to the puck rather than miss the puck where it's going to be. You have to have predictive models in place.
It won't look the same, but I sincerely hope that we fundamentally change the way we view data sharing and collaboration as a result of the crisis, and that some of the openness to collaborate more stays after we settle into
Stephanie, the problem is exactly what Stephen said, that the core competitive advantage in the future is not people and not machines, data. So it's when you think that data is the core competitive advantage, you become less optimistic about sharing data.
Yes, unless it benefits you.
Yeah,
right? And supply chain is so interconnected that we see more and more of our customers leaning into sharing data, not necessarily with the world at large. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens, but with the various parties that impact their business, and being more transparent with that data, because that's their next frontier of improving their own operations.
That's great. We could probably do a whole, I think, roundtable on this. I think we've hit on a very good point here. So Krishnan, thank you for the question. Brett, you want to move to the next one?
Yes. Professor Sheffy, Michael White asks a question that really picks up on one of the comments you made in your interview. He asks, or first says, one of the issues for air cargo has been the lack of using electronic information by some carriers and governments instead of paper documents. Do you see the pandemic may actually drive the need to go paperless and help support better data in the supply chain?
First of all, I hate it when people use my quotes against me, but but let me try to answer it. There is so much, we all know that we talk about all these electronic transactions, and in so many cases, they end up in a piece of paper. They have a piece of paper that somebody gave in 3 copies, and, it's actually, 1950s type logistics, but it still takes place. It's not only, it's in air cargo, it's in everything. Yes, my guess is that there is a huge, if you ask every CEO of every company, not only aircraft or every company, what's the #1 concern in the next 12 months, it's the safety of their employees. The number one concern. Then they talk about safety of customers coming in, they talk about risk management, talk about a lot of other things. But safety of employee always comes #1. And because of this, there will be a push, sometimes even by union, sometimes by a ground employee, and sometimes by responsible senior management, to limit the contact points and to get more to digital. And then, of course, once it's digital, you can do a lot more things with it, as we all know. But there will be a lot more effort in getting it digital. We have it in some areas. We have it. If you are a vessel owner and come to the port of Singapore, everything is done online. There's no piece of paper between the vessel and the port. I mean, everything is done online. So it can be done, and these are complex, manifest, and subject to a lot of regulation. Done online, ships are cleared well before they come to the port. It can be done. So the question is there a will to do it? And I think there's a forcing function. The COVID, the pandemic right now is a forcing function that even coming from the employees who will insist on it.
Indeed.
So I think the reality is that this has been a movement for many, many years, right? We've been talking about it. And, you know, I'm reminded of a colleague of mine that works in Denmark, and she pointed out that, you know, for our company, we've been talking about digital transformation for 7 years. When COVID came, we did it in 7 days. And so sometimes you need a push based on circumstances to make the right things happen. It was going to happen anyway. It was just taking too long. That was the issue. Right. And in other parts of, you know, the supply chain, the data is there. If you look at, you know, coming back to the Walmart example, why did Walmart put in electronic point of sale systems? It wasn't because they wanted cashiers to be more productive, because they wanted detailed data and they wanted it in real time. And they were able to completely change the efficiency of managing product to the store shelves in that way. And specifically, able to do that by sharing with the vendors, not just using it internally, but actually sharing it with their vendors. The same thing will happen as we move backwards in the supply chain, as we create more digital capability in those places as well.
Yeah, in fact, several of our trucking partners have indicated to us that one of the big discoveries of this crisis is you did not need to do everything in triplicate. That you could do all of this contactless. So that has indeed been quite a revelation. Stephanie, any thoughts on this matter as well? Or?
I think the only thing I'll add is we've seen a huge spike in questions about EBOL, EPOD, and other electronic processes for things in and around the warehouse that typically handled on paper. So I'll just echo what I heard, and we're definitely seeing it in demand from shippers.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Brett, you want to move to the next one?
Yes, Stephanie, sticking with you, Jerry Quant has the following question. He says, visibility up and down the supply chain is hindered by Chinese walls that have been constructed under the guise of information security. Will these come down due to the increased need for broader visibility?
I hope so. We don't currently do business in China, primarily because of restrictions around data and information security. So our visibility starts at the port, and we do port to door out of China. So I'm not intimately familiar with kind of where they are on, you know.
Well, Stephanie, I think he's, you know, it's a quote unquote Chinese wall term of art. Just talk about borders to, you know, not getting access to information. How will that be changed?
Sorry.
Not strictly China. Sorry to have.
I was like, yep, that's awesome. So do we see this crisis breaking down the walls that typically kept companies apart?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. I think so. I've talked about it a little bit, but we see a lot more companies opening up to sharing data. And very often these conversations have business needs to share data, have people wanting to share data, but they get caught up very often in legal departments, right? For the permissioning and legal documents that are necessary to share data between companies. And through this crisis, we've seen that subside. We've seen things getting pushed through legal. We've seen business teams kind of overriding the bureaucracy that used to exist, and companies really coming together to promote transparency. And we've seen, I'd say, probably a handful of large-scale shippers and retailers who are becoming very vocal about it, and really pushing their peers to break down walls and start sharing data. And the really nice thing about it is those folks that are being vocal are sharing very real examples for why it matters. They're talking about dwell time, detention, safety stock, and major changes that they've been able to make in their business based on the sharing of data. And so I think that will bring real change even after the crisis.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that? Yossi, Stephen, or?
Nobody was covered in the earlier.
It's she said, she gives such a complete answer that nobody wants to do it.
All right. Sounds good. Great. Brett, you want to?
Yeah, I've got a real question related to China from Ray Dunn that I'd like to steer towards Professor Sheffy. And he wants to know what the expectations for moving supply chains to the US and Europe away from China may be like in the future.
Okay, that's, of course, the media was full of it. You know, going out of China, the media is really colored by medical supplies when we are really dependent on China. I'm not talking about PPEs, I'm talking about antibiotics, I'm talking about several very important therapeutics that we are dependent on China. But let's put this aside because this can be handled with a real, as I was mentioning in my presentation, this can be, we don't need to move out, this can be handled by a real safety stock, a real strategic US safety stock, if we don't want to. We can move it too, of course, but it's not clear this is the best way to do it. But people are talking about reshoring in general. So people are going to China today for two reasons. Some people went to China because of low cost. These people, because of tariffs, are already moving out of China, only they're not moving to the US. They're moving to Vietnam, they're moving to Indonesia, they're moving to Costa Rica. They're not moving to the US because the cost structure in the US cannot support garment manufacturing, for example. So put this, so that's one thing. There are people who are now in automotive, in high tech, in avionics even, people who buy Chinese parts. These Chinese suppliers are unbelievably good. They're just good. They are sophisticated, they have their own R&D. It's not the old Chinese suppliers with a, they don't have even a floor, they have only a gravel floor. Very sophisticated manufacturing, very good manufacturing. I don't see companies leaving it, or at least it will take time. You can always leave with enough time, enough money, you can always move. But it will be very hard to move because you need to build a whole complete ecosystem in the United States, or talk about Europe, the United States, the Western world. It's not clear that that can be done. Finally, let's not forget, well, one before finally, let's not forget that China is a large and growing market. So companies who are talking about multinationals who need to sell to China, they'll stay in China. And finally, the final point is that in manufacturing products in general, the world needs China more than China needs the world. A big, trade war will hurt everybody. Clearly, it will hurt the West more than it will hurt China. For a variety of reasons, I can go into them, but it will hurt us badly. It will hurt China, but we're going to lose in this. So now the issue is becoming not supply chain but political. I would very much argue for. I understand that China steals technology and forces IP, into their own companies and all this. Dealing it with tariffs and words that are just trying to insult each other is ridiculous. I mean, we're looking at this and say, are these people grown-ups? What's going on here? Don't they understand that, for example, if we decided to starve Huawei and not sell them chips, which, by the way, they depend on some of the chips. The Chinese depend on many integrated circuits. They don't have their own production ability. And they're awful because they are restricting PPE or restricting something else. Really? That's tit for tat going on here. And the fact that our, senior management call it does not find a better solution for this or better dialogue, and you can absolutely imagine that Germany and other and all the European countries are suffering the same thing from China. So one can imagine creating a bloc of Western countries that approach China as one and have much more power than the US. Anyway, let me not go into politics at all. Let me stop right there. And
so we're approaching the conclusion of our roundtable today, but I kind of wanted to go around the room and see if there are any final thoughts for us here. Again, going back possibly to the role of technology on supply chains, kind of our main theme here today. Anything that you all would like to add, in closing? And Stephen, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I would say in the spirit of never letting a good crisis go to waste, we need to take some of the digital processes that have been put into place and make that the new norm, right? This is the way things ought to be, and don't get reset. Because they're in a shorter crisis, sometimes there's this tendency to just kind of muscle through it and then go back to the way things were. I think that the silver lining around the very dark cloud of an extended pandemic is we're going to be forced to rethink things, be forced to think digital, be forced to think about how to use data to be more adaptive, and to the point of the earlier Q&A, and how to share data to make things more efficient for everybody. Those would be the points that I would take out.
Thank you. Yossi?
I would just repeat my last point that when I made in the talk, which I'm worried about, the fact that when you talk to companies who used to at least talk a good game on environmental sustainability, it's now not in the top 5 concerns. It's now, as I say, employee being worrying about employees, worrying about even worrying about digitizing. That's up there, risk management, but corporate social responsibility is dropping fast, and this will be a mistake for the ages. So I hope people will, as we come out of this, people will not forget about it. That's all.
Thank you. Stephanie, you get the final word.
Final word, and it will be a repetitive one, but I think it's important. I will repeat a little bit of what Stephen said. It's really important that we stay focused on what we learned during this crisis and continue to lean into sharing data, using data in an action-oriented way, and collaborating, right? This is all about technology, and I think it's very important that as we explore new technologies, we figure out how to apply machine learning, we figure out how to use data on a grander scale, that we stay focused on doing so in action-oriented ways that help our businesses to become more efficient over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these words and for your time and participating in this roundtable today. Thank you as well to our audience that has asked us, sent us good questions and participated, for the last 2 hours with us. Next week, we will meet again. Our 7th asynchronous virtual roundtable will focus on trucking operations and supply chain resilience under COVID-19. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.